The morning Wren Calloway found a man unconscious in her print shop doorway. She did what any sensible woman in Halifax would do. She checked his pockets first. There was nothing in them. No coin, no calling card, no letter bearing a seal. Just a man with a badly split brow, boots worn through at the heel, and hands that, oddly, were not the hands of someone who had ever gone hungry a long time. The knuckles were scarred in a way that spoke of use, yes, but the fingers were straight and the nails, beneath the dirt, were trimmed. Wren noticed such things. Her late husband had always said she noticed too much for her own peace of mind, and he had probably been right. She dragged the man inside before the fishmonger across the lane could make a morning out of staring. His name, when he came around 20 minutes later with a cup of her second-best tea pressed into his hands, was given as Owen. Just Owen. He offered it with a slightly dazed look and did not volunteer a surname, and Wren, who had lived 31 years and run a print shop alone for 4 of them, did not press. Halifax was the kind of city where people sometimes needed to be just one name for a while. "You've a cut above your eye that wants stitching," she told him, "and I've a press with a broken feed mechanism and a stack of contracts due by Friday. If you can fix the one, I'll see to the other and give you a meal." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes, she noticed, were a very dark grey, the colour the harbour went in November, right before a storm. "I know nothing about printing presses," he said. "I know," she said. "But you'll learn." That was how it began. With a broken mechanism and a practical woman and a man who gave only half a name. Owen proved a quick study which Wren had half expected from the hands. There was something in the way he approached the press. Careful, methodical. The way a person learns a new language by first taking apart the grammar, that told her he was accustomed to mastering things. He made mistakes, and he made them honestly, and when he did, he said so rather than covering them over, which put him ahead of the last 2 apprentices she'd tried to keep. By Thursday, the feed mechanism was mended. By Friday, the contracts were delivered. By the following Monday, Owen had quietly fixed the hinge on the back door that Wren had been meaning to address for 3 months, and she had quietly moved his sleeping pallet from the storeroom floor to the small room above the stairs where her husband's brother had stayed, briefly, before the arrangement proved unworkable for everyone involved. She told herself it was purely practical. The room was empty. He was useful. The winter coming off the Atlantic that year had teeth. What she did not tell herself, because she was not quite ready to hear it, was that she had begun listening for his step on the stair in the mornings. Wren's print shop, Calloway & Sons, which had always been a somewhat aspirational name, given that there were no sons, and she had inherited it from her father rather than any husband, occupied the narrow building on Barrington Street that smelled permanently of ink and damp wood, and on good days, the bread from the bakery 2 doors along. Her father, Hugh Calloway, had built the business on legal documents and church announcements and the occasional pamphlet for causes he believed in. Wren had maintained all of that and added, carefully, a small line of printed trade cards and broadsheets that kept the money steadier through the slow seasons. She knew her business the way she knew her own hands. She knew which paper stocks buckled in humidity and which inks ran when the temperature dropped. She knew which clients paid promptly and which needed 3 invoices and a personal visit. She had learned after Daniel's death that the shop was the thing she could rely on, not in any romantic sense, but in the plain, daily sense that it needed her, and she needed it, and between them they managed. Owen fit into the shop the way a well-cut mortise fits its tenon, cleanly, without forcing. He did not attempt to take over, which she had half braced for. Instead, he watched how she did things, and then did them the same way, and when he had a different idea, he asked first. The asking itself was notable enough that she mentioned it to her friend Judith over tea one afternoon. "He asks," Wren said. Judith, who had been married to a Kakupa for 22 years, looked at her with something between sympathy and amusement. "Yes, that's rare," she said dryly. "Hold on to it." She learned pieces of him the way you learn a coastline, slowly from the water, one inlet at a time. He had been educated, that much was clear from the first week. He read quickly and retained everything. Once, when she was setting type for a legal notice and mispronounced a Latin phrase under her breath, he corrected her automatically, and then looked immediately as though he wished he hadn't. He knew wines, though he never touched the cheap stuff she kept for clients. He had opinions, careful, considered ones, about architecture, about the harbour, about the particular way Halifax managed its winter light. He did not talk about where he had come from. She respected that. She had things she did not talk about either. The months after Daniel's funeral, the letter from her father-in-law that had suggested, very politely, that she might find the business difficult to maintain alone, and perhaps would consider selling to a party he knew. The quiet, cold satisfaction she had felt mailing her reply. Some things you carry small and internal, and they are none of anyone's business until you decide they are. By December, she had stopped thinking of him as a temporary solution to the broken press. She had simply stopped thinking of him as temporary at all, which was its own kind of problem, and one she was careful not to examine too closely in the evenings, when the shop was quiet, and he sat across the table, doing accounts with the same focused silence he brought to everything. It was Judith who first said it aloud, of course. Judith had known Wren since they were girls, sharing a school bench on Gottingen Street, and had never once managed to leave a thing unspoken that might as well be spoken. "You're fond of him. He's reliable," Wren said. "Wren, he's an excellent. Wren." She set down her cup. Outside, the December sleet was making its case against the window. "It doesn't matter whether I am," she said finally. "He has no money, no position, no future that I can see, and he has secrets. Not small ones. Everyone has secrets. Not like his." She had thought about it more than she had admitted. The education that didn't match the boots. The way he sometimes went still when a carriage bearing a certain kind of crest rolled past the shop window. The letter that had arrived in November. No return address. The paper a quality she recognized from the orders she sometimes did for Government House, which he had read standing in the storeroom doorway, and then folded very carefully and put in the inside pocket of his coat, and which he had not mentioned. "There's something he's not telling me. Something large. Perhaps," Judith said, "you might try asking." Wren picked up her cup. "Perhaps," she said, and changed the subject. She did not ask, not directly. What she did instead, because she was her father's daughter and her father had always believed that information came to the patient, was pay attention. The letter had a twin in January. Same paper, same absence of return address. This time she happened to be in the storeroom when it arrived, and she saw his face when he recognized the handwriting on the outside. A very brief, very controlled sequence of expressions that moved from something like dread to something like resignation, to something that was, she thought, relief, though not the comfortable kind. He caught her watching. To his credit, he did not pretend she wasn't. "There are things I should have told you," he said. "Yes," she agreed, keeping her voice level. "There are." He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone choosing words that will change the shape of a room. The sleet from December had turned to a hard January cold, and the small stove in the corner was working hard, and the smell of ink was everywhere, and Wren thought, whatever he says next, I am not going to make it easy for him by reacting before he's finished. "My name is not Owen," he said. "Or, it is, but it is not all of it. My full name is Owen Alderton Crestwood. I am the 5th Marquess of Dunmore." The room was very quiet. "The Marquess of Dunmore," she said. "Not a question. Not yet." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the carriage with the crest, the letter from Government House stock, the education behind the worn boots, the way he had stood in her storeroom doorway, looking at the second letter, with the expression of a man returning to something he had been trying to convince himself he'd left behind. "Why," she said finally, "were you unconscious in my doorway with nothing in your pockets?" He sat down, which was the sensible thing to do. She remained standing, which was her prerogative. His father, the 4th Marquess, had died in September. The estate, the title, the full weight of Dunmore had come down on Owen in the middle of a period of his life that he described carefully, as one in which he had been attempting to learn what the world looked like without the insulation of a title around him. He had been 3 months into working on a merchant vessel out of St. John when the news reached him. He had come to Halifax on the first ship he could board. He had been set upon by 2 men near the waterfront, a robbery, he believed, opportunistic rather than targeted, and had ended up on Barrington Street with an empty pocket and a split brow, and then A woman with ink-stained hands had checked his pockets and dragged him inside. "I was going to tell you," he said. "In the beginning, I thought, a few days. Rest the head, get my bearings, arrange for money to be sent. But then," he stopped, started again. "The shop needed someone, and I found I wanted to be someone who could be useful. Not," he paused again, working through it honestly, "not a marquess who pities a widow, her broken press, just a man who could fix it." Wren set her cup down on the shelf beside her very carefully. "You let me pay you in meals," she said, "and a room above my stairs. For 4 months, yes, when you have an estate, yes, in Perthshire." She turned to look at the press, her father's press, the machine that had held this family together through more than one season of difficulty, and she breathed. In. Out, the stove crackled. Somewhere, on the street, a cart horse registered its displeasure at the cold. "Get out of my storeroom," she said. She did not mean out of the shop. He seemed to understand the distinction, because he went back to the front room without another word, and she stood alone with the press and the ink smell and the January cold pressing against the single storeroom window, and she put both hands flat on the work table, and she breathed until she felt like herself again. She did not speak to him beyond necessity for 3 days. She was not, she told herself firmly, heartbroken. That would require having permitted something that she had not permitted. What she was angry, and the anger was legitimate, and she was entitled to it, and she worked through it, the way she worked through everything, by continuing to work. The press ran, the contracts went out. Owen, the Marquess of Dunmore, Lord Crestwood, whatever she was supposed to call him now, did his part of the work without being asked and without making speeches about it, which was possibly the only thing about the situation she did not have a grievance with. On the 3rd evening, he left a book on the end of the work table near where she typically stood. It was a volume on the history of papermaking in Scotland, which he could only have found at the bookseller on Granville Street, and it was either a peace offering or a comment on her profession, or both. Wren looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then she put it on the shelf above the press, where she kept at the things she meant to read, and she allowed herself to feel a small, complicated warmth that she immediately decided she was not responsible for. It was Judith again in the end. Judith, and the fact that Wren had never once in her life been able to sustain dishonesty with herself past a certain point. "What is it you're actually angry about?" Judith asked on the 4th day. "That he lied, or that you might have to make a decision you didn't expect to make?" Wren had been about to say the lying. Obviously, it was obviously the lying, but the sentence stopped itself halfway out of her mouth, and she sat with it for an uncomfortable moment. "Both," she said finally. "But perhaps not in the proportions I assumed. He came to you with nothing," Judith said, "and he stayed because of you, not in spite of the shop, because of it, because of how you run it and who you are in it." She tilted her head slightly. "That's not nothing, Wren. He has an estate in Perthshire. So, I have a print shop in Halifax." "Yes," Judith said patiently. And Wren looked at her. "You think those things are incompatible," Judith said. "But does he?" She found him in the shop after supper, which was where he usually was in the evenings, working through whatever she'd left him by way of the next day's typesetting. The light was low, and the stove was warm, and he looked up when she came in with the slightly careful expression he had adopted since the storeroom conversation, the expression of a man who was not going to assume anything. She respected that too, which was inconvenient. "I have questions," she said. She sat down across the table from him, the way she had been sitting across tables from him for 4 months, and she folded her hands in front of her. "And I want honest answers, not managed ones." "Yes," he said. "All right. Do you intend to go back to Scotland?" "I have to. There are responsibilities The estate has been managed by my solicitor since September, but I can't leave it indefinitely." "And if you went back," she said, "what would that look like? For a man with a title and an estate in Perthshire." He was quiet for a moment. "It would look like what it is," he said. "Work. Most of it unglamorous. My father left the estate in reasonable condition, but the tenants want seeing to, and the house wants repairs, and there are obligations to the county that I've inherited along with the rest of it." He paused. "I am not going back to what you might be imagining. I am going back to a very large set of responsibilities that happen to have a title attached, "And what," she said carefully, "do you imagine that has to do with me?" He looked at her steadily. The dark grey eyes, the harbour before a storm. "I hope," he said, "that it has a great deal to do with you. If you're willing, I'm not going to become someone else," Wren said. "I want you to understand that before you say anything further. I am a printer's daughter and a printer's widow, and I run this shop and I know what I'm doing in it. And I am not going to set that down because it would be more convenient for a Marquess to have a wife who doesn't smell of ink." "I know," he said. "I mean it." "I know that too," he said. "Wren, I have spent 4 months watching you run this shop. I did not fall in love with someone I intended to change." The word sat in the air between them. Love. He had said it plainly, without dressing it up or hedging it, which was either courage or recklessness, and she was not entirely sure at the moment that the distinction mattered. "The shop stays," she said. "The shop stays. I'll need someone competent to manage it if I'm to spend any part of the year in Scotland. Which I am not committing to, of course, and I will not be introduced anywhere as a trophy or a curiosity or evidence of your democratic sympathies." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I wouldn't dare. You might dare," she said. "But you would regret it. Wren." "What?" He stood up from the table and came around it, and he stopped a correct and careful distance away, and he said, "May I?" She considered it for a moment. The shop around her. The press, the ink, the books on the shelf, the volume on Scottish paper-making that she had moved to a place of prominence and was not going to pretend she hadn't. 4 months of mornings and the step she had been listening for on the stair. "Yes," she said, "you may." Owen returned to Perthshire in March, carrying with him a signed agreement, drawn up by Wren herself, set in type on her own press, because she was who she was, that outlined the terms under which she would consider making the arrangement permanent. It was not a love letter, exactly. It was more than that. It was a woman handing a man her terms and trusting him to meet them, which is a more significant thing than most poems manage. He met them. He came back to Halifax in June with a solicitor and a ring that had been in the Crestwood family for 4 generations. And he stood in the print shop on Barrington Street, with ink on the sleeve of his very good coat, because he had been helping with the afternoon run when the solicitor arrived. And he asked her. She said yes. She said it looking him directly in the eye, the way she looked at every contract before she signed it, and she meant it entirely. They married in September at St. Paul's, small and quiet, with Judith as her witness and Owen's younger brother, who turned out to be exactly as thoughtful as his sibling and considerably funnier, standing up for the groom. Wren wore her best dress, which was dark blue and practical, and she did not change her name on the shop sign, because Calloway and Sons had been in business in this city, longer than the current Marquess of Dunmore had been alive, and it had earned its place on Barrington Street. And she was not sentimental about the right things. She was, she found, sentimental about the wrong ones. The book on Scottish paper-making that she packed in her trunk for the months they would spend at the estate. The particular way he stood at the press, careful, methodical, as though he still meant to earn his place in it. The mornings. The step on the stair which she had finally stopped pretending she wasn't listening for. There were people who found the arrangement unusual. A marchioness who kept a print shop, who travelled back and forth between Halifax and Perthshire as her schedule demanded, who could be found on Barrington Street on any given Tuesday with her sleeves rolled and her hands dark with ink. There were people who thought she ought to want more than the shop, or less than the title, or something that fit more neatly into the available categories. Wren had never found the available categories particularly useful. The shop flourished. So did the estate, which it turned out had been waiting for someone with her particular talent for systems and ledgers. The tenants, whom she visited in her first autumn in Perthshire and listened to for 3 solid days before saying a word, decided they approved of her. The county was less certain, but the county came around eventually, because she was patient and consistent, and she did not require their approval in order to proceed, which is typically the fastest way to earn it. Owen learned, over those first years, that she had been telling the truth in the print shop. She was not going to become someone else. He had told her he didn't want her to. He had meant it. But knowing a thing and living it are different, and there were moments. when she declined a dinner party because she had a print run to oversee, when she sent back a gift from a neighbouring estate because it felt like an obligation she hadn't agreed to, when he had to choose again to mean what he'd said. He always did. She noticed, and she was grateful, and she did not make him small by saying so too often. What she did instead was bring him coffee in the estate's cold library on the mornings she could see the ledgers were defeating him, and sit across the table the way she had always sat across tables from him, and not say anything unless he asked, because some kinds of company don't require words to count. And he, for his part, learned early which ink to order for the Halifax winter paper stocks, and kept track of it without being asked. It was, all told, a reasonable partnership. It was also something considerably more than that, though neither of them was inclined to make speeches about it. They had both learned by that point that the things that last rarely need to announce themselves. The sign on Barrington Street still read Calloway and Sons. It still smelled of ink and damp wood, and on good days the bread from 2 doors along. And if the Marchioness of Dunmore was sometimes to be found there, on a Tuesday afternoon, setting type with the focused quiet of someone doing exactly what they were meant to do, well, Halifax had seen stranger things, and most of them had turned out fine.